Ellen. Thank you so much for joining us today. To start, could you please introduce yourself and explain how you were involved in the beginnings of the internet, please?
Well, my name is Alan Emtage. I created the first internet search engine back in 1989. I was working as a graduate student at McGill University in Montreal, and I was also working as a system administrator for the same School of Computer Science that I was studying at. And one of my responsibilities was to locate information on the internet for my students and my professors and my faculty. And that information at the time this was before the web, that information at the time was stored on FTP servers, file transfer protocol servers, and they were freely available. They were called anonymous FTP servers, and which just meant that you could log in anonymously. You didn't have to have a signed login. And so I found myself going to these servers fairly regularly to try and locate information. And I finally realized that doing that manually was not only tedious, it wasn't very efficient. So I developed a set of scripts to retrieve the information, listings of what each server had, and store it on my local computer. So I could search those listings locally rather than having to try and go through them remotely. Now, at the time, McGill's connection to the internet was 9600 baud. So I don't think anybody nowadays even understands how slow that is, but 9.6 kilobits a second. So pretty slow. So these scripts would operate at night when the internet wasn't being used very much. Now, remember, the internet was very small back in 1990. It was usually only universities and companies, corporations that were research organizations. So, IBM would have a research arm and they would be connected and so on. And people were mostly using it for email, not very much in the way of remote access, telnet, and that kind of thing. So I built this little script, and word got out that I had this information, and people started asking me to run searches on my local database for them. And we pretty soon realized that was not an efficient thing to do, because having me involved in doing manual searches was very inefficient. And so we built a little interface so that people could log in from remotely into the search and do the searches for themselves. And that we call that Archie, which is just archive without the V. So and that's how it was launched in, I believe the date is September 11th, 1990. So 35 years ago now.
Yeah, I still like to know about back in those early days, the internet was still mostly academic and research tool. So how would you describe the culture of the internet community then compared to what it has become now? Like the differences?
Oh, the huge difference. Yeah. Back then, money wasn't a motivating factor. There wasn't any thought really. Actually, at the time when we were first doing it, commercial activity wasn't allowed on the internet, if you can believe that. It was the money funding the internet at the time was the National Science Foundation, which was an educational government funding body, and they did not allow commercial activity. So the culture back then was very much an academic one, exploring what this new tool could do, what this new technology could do. And so people were working very cooperatively, and there really wasn't much thought to making money off of it. That was something that, clearly it was clear that, in the future, that would be used for commercial activity. But at the time, in the late 80s and the very early 90s, it was very much a playground of technologists who were interested in figuring out, how best to use this tool. So I was working with people like Vint Cerf, who created the protocols that run the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web, Mark McCahill, who was working on a system called Gopher at the time, which was an information retrieval system. So yeah, it was very much a research and exploration of the technology.
Yeah, so from your perspective, what were the most important turning points in the earliest internet's history, and were there particular moments like you feel realized that things will never be the same again?
The turning points, well, of course. So I would have said the turning points were the creation of TCP/IP, which was where the protocols for running the entire internet were created. I would say the first email, the first telnet session, which allowed somebody to remotely log in to another computer. Going forward, search engine, World Wide Web. Well, Gopher was in there as well. It was the idea that you could you could locate information on the internet. People don't realize that computing power was really expensive back then. Computers were very expensive. Many computers were very expensive. And so the idea of letting other people use your computer was not something that was part of the culture, because, that meant you could use your computer less because somebody else was using it as well. As computing power became cheaper and more and increased, that became less of a concern. But back in the 80s, the idea that some random person from the other side of the country could log on and you use your computer resources was not something that was very common. So that was a big cultural change as well as a practical change. So I would say those were the big turning points. And then of course when the web came along, that really made it accessible to the general public in a way that didn't require much in the way of technical knowledge at all. So that was a huge shift. The thing is, when did we realize? I suppose it didn't immediately occur to us the changes that were coming. I remember the first time looking at the Netscape browser, and well, it was even before that, I guess, the World Wide Web browser from the University of Illinois. And you could embed, because up until this point, everything was text. And for the first time on the web, you could actually have images as well as text visible on a page, because people don't realize the first web browser was just text, was just a text browser. It was text, and then there would be numbers next to the links. And if you wanted to follow a link, you would type the number and it would go to that link. So it wasn't even a mouse. You didn't even use a mouse. The text just came up on your screen. And so you would navigate by typing in numbers to the next link. So the first time that you saw text and images integrated, I think for me was a real revelation. That was probably 1995, I guess, 94 or 95 probably. And that really opened a whole new world of what you could do with the internet.
Yeah, and also I have another question about you were also deeply involved with the IETF and standardization efforts. So for looking back, how important do you think these collaborative processes were in making sure the internet stayed open and interruptible as it grew?
It was essential. The standards were not being created by some government organization from the top down. The standards were being created from the bottom up, right? By the people who were actually using the technology, understood what the technology was, the ability to interoperate so that everybody understood what a URL looked like, what a network packet looked like. All of those things require that everybody speak the same language. I mean, the same computer language, right? That the same protocols are understood and are very precise. They have to be very precisely written so that even if you aren't able to read the original language, English or in the original thing, that when it's translated in such a way that people can understand what every character means, how you interoperate. So, which reminds me, one of the turning points in the internet was also the creation of DNS, which allowed you to translate IP addresses into URLs, names, back and forth. What people don't realize is for email, for example, when I started using email, if you wanted to contact somebody, if you wanted to send an email for me in McGill University to say University of Texas, you had to know the path that email was going to take for every computer that email was going to take between yourself and the University of Texas. So you actually had to compose a path saying, no, you send it to that computer. When it gets to that computer, you send it to that computer, and then because the internet wasn't all connected. right? So it was dial-up lines. So you would use phone lines. So the computer would wake up and it would call the other computer and send it the email. And then that computer would store it and then call the next one along the line. So the ability of DNS to be able to say, oh, I know what the IP address of that computer is over there, I can send it directly without hopping through the system. So that was the 80s. That's how email got sent in the 1980s. So, but yeah, the IETF is still essential to creating the internet standards. And it hasn't even, I don't think it's much bigger than when I was using it. When I was attending it or, working with it, it was about 700 people. And I think I'm not sure if it's that much bigger than that. It's a very small group of people who are doing that work.
Yes, so also one more is you have spoken before about not being widely recognized of your role until later in your career. So how do you feel about the recognition in internet history and both for yourself and for many of the entrepreneurs whose work underpinned the technologies we take for granted?
I think this is a fairly common phenomenon in technology, There are very few people who the general public certainly knows become a household name, you get people like, it's a rare scientist that becomes widely known or technologist that becomes widely known. And so in our case, maybe Tim Berners-Lee is probably the best known person as the creator of the World Wide Web, would have more recognition. But, there were a lot of people who worked on all of these technologies and you don't know the name of most of them. So I'm not surprised, there's no reason why people would necessarily would know my name, within certain circles, yes, but it's, and also when technology is actually happening, when it is actually when it's being developed and deployed, first of all, there are probably dozens of people working on, or at least dozens of people working on any particular small area. And so it doesn't bother me that it took a while. And still, I mean, I'm not very well widely known. It's not a problem. I know fame was never my goal. I mean, there are a few people, like these days, people know the name Elon Musk, but Elon Musk didn't develop the technology for the companies that he
Yeah.
is running, right?
Yes.
That work was done by other people. But he is the face of the technology, but he's not a technologist himself. It's just the nature of things. I'm not it doesn't bother me that much, really.
Okay, I heard you mention the World Wide Web. So the arrival of the World Wide Web in the earlier 1990s transformed everything. So how did you see Archie's place in relation to the web at that time, and how do you view that transaction today?
Well, Archie, I mean, there were two different technologies, right? So
Yes.
Archie worked on FTP and the web created its own environment, its own technology. The first search engine for the web was called AliWeb. And it was called Archie because it was called Archie-like interface to the web. So the first web search engine was actually named after Archie. And it was created by a guy called Martin Koster, who was a colleague of mine who worked in the Netherlands. And so the first web search engine was actually named after Archie because Archie created the idea for a search engine. That's the connection between those two things, right? We never tried to build a web search engine. We were working on other things at the time. So we never tried to build a web search engine, but Archie inspired the web search engines. And it used a lot of the same techniques that Archie had pioneered in technology circles, but not, I mean, nobody would know about Archie now as an actual operating search engine, right?
Yes. So finally, reflecting on your career, what lessons from the earlier days of the internet would you want to share with the next new generation, those who will be documenting or shaping the internet's future?
Well, it's hard to imagine these days, but I would say that, don't let money be your first motivator. If you're really trying to create something new and interesting, do that. If the money follows, then great, but don't necessarily chase the money as your primary aim. That's that's the world we live in nowadays. But I would say if you're really trying to be, often nowadays the technology requires money, so you need capital investment, and the people who are investing are going to want you to make money. So it becomes that kind of circle. When you're working on the very basic level of the ground floor, it's a lot easier, right? Now it's a mature technology, and so it's a lot harder to create something new. But I would say, my advice was follow your vision, and if money is important to you, hope that money comes afterward.
Yeah, thank you for interviewing with me today, Alan. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I hope you get the information you need out of it.
Yes, it really helped. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome.